Eating a plant-based diet certainly changed my life and allowed me, I think, at one point in my life, I think I told this in the blog, was that I thought my career was going to be over. Like I wouldn't be able to compete anymore. And once I switched to 100% plant-based diet, I was able to get back into the game and have continued that for a long time.
The story of our guest today, Dr. Sharon McDowell-Larsen, is one of perpetual movement. A plant-based athlete and former coach at the Center for Creative Leadership, she lived on multiple continents and competed in Ironman triathlons, mountain bike races, ultra trail races, and Nordic ski races, just to name a few. Dr. McDowell-Larsen has a PhD in exercise physiology from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and she has guided some of the world's top leaders to peak performance in health and in fitness. Now, currently, she's co-writing a book about aging athletes on plant-based diets. We're really lucky to have her here to share her extreme wealth of knowledge with us for so many of you who are aspiring athletes or current athletes, or weekend warriors, right? Like I am now. This is an episode that you don't want to miss, so I am going to just dive right in, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here. It's such an honor. Thank you.
Well, I got to start with a story that you shared so kindly and willingly on the Switch4Good blog. It is about Ironman, the big Ironman in Kona, and your experience through the Energy Lab. And for everyone that knows Kona and that place of hell where you're on the run, and it starts to get really nasty, and it's just an overwhelming amount of heat that is coming down because it is there are no trees, there's no shade, it's just blacktop in you. And I've been to Ironman Kona 6 or 7 times, and I haven't done it, but I've been there, and it is so hot. And you tell a story about thinking you are a machine. And I'll let you tell kind of where that's from, but why I want you to tell the story and what we're going to obviously dive into, to name a few things on this podcast, is why does eating plants make you feel like a machine?
Wow. Okay. Well, certainly I think, I definitely attribute my longevity as an athlete to my plant-based diet. And we can get into the reasons for that and why that's such an important aspect to what I call staying in the game, right? And being able to compete as we advance in years and continue to optimize performance. But, I think that just eating a plant-based diet certainly changed my life and allowed me, I think, at one point in my life, I think I told this in the blog, was that I thought my career was going to be over. Like I wouldn't be able to compete anymore. And once I switched to 100% plant-based diet, I was able to get back into the game and have continued that for a long time. But yeah, so the whole machine, I am a machine, that was my mantra during the run. And I was initially feeling very sort of defeated at the beginning because it was so hot. And I thought, there's no way I can finish this. And then I'm sure many of you have watched the Game Changers documentary, and Dotsie was on there, and she was saying after she switched that she became a machine. And so that sort of popped into my head. And I was like, all right, I am a machine. And so it became all about just one step in front of the other, and being sort of machine-like, I guess. And it worked. I mean, it just kept me going through the entire marathon. And so I ran the whole thing. I didn't have to walk it like I expected.
Yeah. So
yeah,
I love that story. And I love how you persevered and came across the finish line. And I think that it's, the machine thing is really, you've got to put in non-human machines and human machines, but I'm speaking of cars and motorcycles, and what you have to put the right fuel in the machine for it to run right. And if someone were to say kind of, give me the top 3 reasons that plants are the optimal fuel for the human body and for human performance. What would you say? You know a lot about this, so I'm putting you in the hot seat.
Okay.
Just 3.
Yeah, or 2 or 7 or what? I mean, we'll take it. Right?
I'll take it. Yeah, I mean, I think that the number one reason is it tends to be high in carbohydrates, and when people eat a more omnivore diet, I mean, studies show that most athletes eat too much protein and not enough carbohydrates. And carbohydrates is so critical for endurance performance, not just during the race, but before the race, after the race. It's important for recovery from the race. On down the line, it's important for gut function, as we'll get into. And then, it's not just carbohydrates, it's the foods, it's how the carbohydrates are packaged. And so they're packaged with antioxidants and other nutrients that are so vital for recovery. And one of the things that happens as we age is that we actually lose our ability to produce what we call endogenous antioxidants. So we make antioxidants internally. So coenzyme Q is one, superoxide dismutase is another one. And so as we age, our ability to make those goes down. And so we can mitigate that by eating a healthy diet and eating a diet that's high in antioxidants. Another critical factor is that we also lose, or we don't tend to produce as much of as we age, is nitric oxide. As we know, nitric oxide is very important for arterial health. It keeps our arteries going smooth. It keeps them acting like Teflon versus Velcro. It improves blood flow to certain areas. It's been shown to improve performance. And so vegetables, particularly leafy greens and beets, for example, are high in nitric oxide. And so when we get older, we can't produce as much. We can mitigate that and offset that by increasing dietary intake of nitric oxide as well. And so when you look at studies looking at benefits to recovery, benefits to performance, certain plant foods have been studied, and specifically things like berries and black currants and beets and, on down the line, have been shown to benefit both recovery, reduce muscle soreness, as well as improve athletic performance. And so I think is that enough reasons, or do you need more?
You passed the test with flying colors. Yeah. Colors in your diet, right? That's what that boils down to. Yeah. Most fantastic.
Yeah.
So if someone were to push back and say, okay, great, it's got nitric oxide, so you can run farther and you recover faster. But what about my bone health? And what about my muscle, which are 2 things that in your book you discuss are very important to age to age gracefully and have a long health span.
Right.
How would you justify a plant-based diet when looking at bone health and muscles?
Yeah. So, this I think is tied actually to gut health. And so when we have a more diverse, abundant set of microbes within our guts, we increase production of these postbiotics. Postbiotics are things like short-chain fatty acids, urethrin A. Another one is equal. You might have heard of equal. And so these metabolites, or these postbiotics, actually do play a role in improved bone health, bone density, muscle function, anti-inflammatory. And one of the other thing that happens, of course, when we get older is we have something called aging. So the inflammation tends to increase with age. Mm-hmm. And so eating a more anti-inflammatory diet can help with that. And it's interesting that, one of the things that you often hear with older athletes or older individuals is we need more protein. We need more protein. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the studies that look at older adults and protein intakes, and this is to prevent both sarcopenia or muscle loss as well as bone density loss as well.
And that's why they're saying it. That was my question. I've seen a lot of muscle loss over the last probably 5 years. I mean, so that's common to lose. Yeah. Okay. As you age.
Yeah, we lose about 2% every decade of muscle mass. Now, the biggest impetus, of course, is to continue hard training. I mean, that's the best stimulus. But when you look at the problem with saying that we need more protein is a little bit treating the symptom rather than cause. And so when we, as I said, as we age, we tend to have higher rates of inflammation. That actually requires more protein. And so when you look at studies on muscle loss and aging, we see healthier diets are associated with less muscle loss. High fiber diets are associated with less muscle loss. So it's not just about the protein. It's also about eating a more healthy, high fiber, nutrient dense diet that's going to help mitigate some of those effects. So I think there's a little bit of reverse causation where people, they eat unhealthy diets, they don't live a healthy lifestyle, and they have higher rates of inflammation. They don't have good insulin sensitivity, so they can't take up the amino acids as well. So all of those factors play into that. And so it's not quite that straightforward just to say, eat more protein as you age. It's not that protein isn't important. Of course it is. And at the end of the day, the muscles don't really care, right? When you consume protein, you break it down to amino acids, you absorb the amino acid. Whether they come from plants or animals, the muscle doesn't care. And so typically you see pretty concordant results or pretty similar outcomes, regardless of whether people consume animal protein or plant protein. But the animal protein, unfortunately, is also high in sulfide-containing amino acids. And so these technically should be digested in the small intestine, but some escapes into the large intestine. And then we have fermentation of protein. And fermentation of carbohydrates is great. That's what you want. That produces healthy postbiotics. Fermentation of protein, on the other hand, particularly those high sulfide containing amino acids, can result in something called putrefaction and the production of metabolites that are associated with increased risk for cancer, increased inflammation. So yeah, I mean, it's not that protein's not important. I do think that the source of protein matters it's quite important from a health perspective. Yeah. Did that make sense? Even
yeah. So maybe not for your muscles will take in the protein, but there's your arteries might not like it as much if it's from animals, or your sleep or whatever. So your other aspects of your health might be affected.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, that's a whole topic by itself, isn't it?
Yes. Every topic that we're going to discover today with you is a topic in itself. But it's not a 5-hour podcast, but we have you back on. But the chapter that we both got the joy to be able to read, that is going to be in your book, and you're working on this awesome book about fueling aging athletes. There's so much in the microbiome in that chapter because that's what it's focused on. And just to start off, some of it I knew, right, from the work that we do, and some of it I did not. And one aspect that I thought was really curious and very intriguing is that the microbiome affects one's biological age. Can you talk to that and go into what that means and why?
Yeah, sure. So when we look at people that are supercentenarians, that are very long-lived, in other words, they live past 100, what we find is their microbiome is actually quite diverse, very abundant, and they produce a lot of postbiotics that are associated with decreases in inflammation and improvements in insulin sensitivity.
Okay, I need to stop you for a second. I should have asked you this when you were talking about. I don't really know what postbiotics are.
So postbiotics are the metabolites that are produced when our bacteria break down and carbohydrates, basically, and fiber, and prebiotics. So we have prebiotics. That's what our microbes feed on. So this can be starches, it can be fiber, it can be polyphenols even. Then we have the postbiotics, which are metabolites. And so the three that are most studied are butyrate, acetate, and propionate. And so really from a health perspective, what you really want is to foster bacteria in your gut that promote higher production of these postbiotics, these short chain fatty acids, as well as other ones that I talked about, like equal as well. And so when you, like I said, when you have a more diverse microbiome and abundance of microbiome, then you tend to have better insulin resistance, or less insulin resistance. You tend to have less inflammation. And so the older adults that they looked at definitely had much higher levels of these postbiotics. And so it makes sense, because part of the aging, of course, again, goes back to inflammation. It goes back to not being as insulin sensitive. And so you have sort of cardiometabolic issues as you age. So again, it's hard to sort of identify cause and effect. There is sort of an aging process. The gut does age, right? It does to a degree, but one of the most commonly cited benefits to aging is consuming a high fiber diet, basically. So lots of plants. Again, it keeps going back to that. Yeah. Yeah, the fuel. Yeah.
You, as you're writing this book for athletes who often can work out a lot and then ignore their diet, but tell us about your thoughts on diet and how important it is to be healthy as we age, even if we're running or exercising regularly, or even doing the ultra marathons and things that you do.
Yeah. Yeah. So, like, a lot of, I see this in a number of older or age group athletes in particular. I think pro athletes are getting better about this, but one of the assumptions that masters athletes make is that I exercise a lot, therefore it doesn't matter what I eat. And so they assume that this is going to protect them from age-related conditions like heart disease or cancer or whatever. And so I tend to think the opposite. I actually think the more you exercise, the more healthy you need to eat, because exercise in and of itself is stressful. What we do as athletes is not health promoting. I mean, to a degree it is. I mean, there's definitely health benefits. Now, it's interesting when you look at population curves.
Well, I just want to make sure that I just want. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Maybe you're going to go. I just want to make sure that people understand they can't chuck out the exercise, even though it's stressful, because it's a good stress.
Yeah, it is. But when we look at population studies and health outcomes such as cardiovascular disease, cancer, and so on, we see the biggest benefit is when people go from nothing to moderate levels of exercise. And then the curve goes back up with higher levels of exercise. And so, the question, of course, is this because they're eating more unhealthy food? Because often that's the justification. If I eat 2,000 calories a day and then I start to train for a marathon, now I eat 3,000 calories a day of a terrible Western diet. The poison is in the dose, right? And so we do see that uptick in premature death, deaths from cardiovascular disease, deaths from cancer, and so on. So yeah, I think, as an older athlete, I eat healthy in order to be able to train and a lot, versus the other way around.
Yeah. I think that something that we just don't tend to think of if we are weekend warriors, let's say, is that intense exercise is damage, and it's intense, gnarly damage. And if you don't effectively and totally repair from it every time, you're going to be tearing your body down overall. And it definitely repairs, I found, faster, more efficiently, and better on plants, but it still doesn't feel good, right? When you're that torn down. I mean, I've just overall, generally, I feel so much better now exercising moderately, definitely moderately compared to what was before. It felt just pretty horrible most days. That, plants made it feel better, but it's like, but that's what I think that we have to realize, right? Is understanding what that damage is, how it affects us, and then what the build back from that damage, how not only energizing it is to us, but how it effectively makes us stronger every time, which is why we damage repair over and over again. we
Yeah,
wouldn't repeat it,
exactly.
right? If it didn't make us better every time.
Yeah, so some of the damage is good. I mean, some of the oxidative stress incurred through exercise is actually a signal to adapt, to get better. And so it is a razor's edge that we ride every day as athletes. Unfortunately, many times we tend to push probably too much to the negative side than the recovery side, because we're a little bit anal creatures, I guess. But yeah, so again, I think that's where. So the antioxidants that I talked about, those endogenous ones, the ones that we make, um, one of the things that exercise does is actually stimulate that process. It does stimulate an increase in our endogenous production of antioxidants, but only up to a point. And so that's where I think the more moderate levels of exercise are very, very good for you, very, very beneficial. It's beneficial to the gut microbiome as well. It induces better gut health as well. But then when you start to get up to the more extreme side of things, that's when, like you said, Dotsie, there's damage. There's damage, and hopefully then you repair and get stronger. Absolutely. Yeah.
What was one aspect of that chapter that I really enjoyed you going into was started with your personal story of Leadville, the 100-mile mountain bike race, and up in Leadville, Colorado, it starts at 10,200 feet. And you talked about digestion was the you had all of these issues that you hadn't really kind of thought through, but for any athlete that's listening, or weekend warrior, it was always just shattering to me to go to altitude, even just to the training center in Colorado Springs, right? That's 6,200 feet or something. Instantly, my digestion slowed way down. I couldn't eat the amount of food that I could eat before. So I had a really hard time figuring out how to fuel between workouts and before workouts and night before. It just wreaks havoc. It also wreaks havoc on sleep. I just can't. I don't even really enjoy going to altitude, quite frankly, because my whole system is just kind of freaks out, and you don't feel good in the beginning, those first days. So talk us through why that is, why it's so difficult to digest at altitude like it is at sea level. And then what happened to you in that race, because you didn't pre-think that scenario either for that specific race.
Yeah, I did some stupid things in that race. And, as I like to say, if you're going to be stupid, you better be tough.
Right. You were.
Yeah. So, I mean, I had actually acclimated quite well to the altitude before that race, but not quite as high. I mean, I was at 9,000 feet to acclimate prior to that. But yeah, I mean, you're right. It can sort of dampen the appetite quite a bit. It can wreak havoc on your gut your gut lining, and cause maybe some dysbiosis there, or not dysbiosis, but loss of gut integrity. So different people react differently to altitude, though. Some are genetically more, some genetically can just adapt more quickly and do better at altitude than others. So I know my husband, when he did the 100-mile run, he was very nauseous. He threw up during the race. So he had a much worse reaction to it than I did. So I think there's a lot of factors that go into that. Now, one of the things that happens at altitude is that you have more levels of oxidative stress because there's more radiation, right? And so again, that oxidative stress can cause damage. There's probably a little bit more inflammation as well. So yeah, I think there's numerous factors that can affect that as well. But I did the run a week later and it was much better. So
yes.
Yeah.
Do you think it has anything to do with some people having an easier time or better time than others with genetics, or if they were raised at altitude? I always found the athletes that I was teammates with who were raised at altitude, I mean, forget it, right? Like we would go to altitude races and it was like, bye-bye. Or I suddenly turned into the domestique because it was like, I was just going to be suffering. Do you think it's either one of those or something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think that plays a role as well, for sure. Being born at altitude. Um, so yeah, I think there's lots of factors. I mean, an interesting study would be, you just have less available oxygen. I mean, that's probably the biggest thing at altitude. So could eating a healthy diet sort of improve blood flow, improve that oxygen availability? There's, if you're eating a high fat diet, one of the things that happens is you have lipemia in the blood. So your blood tends to get, quite filled. It's called lactescence. It gets quite milky with the fat. And then that inhibits the ability of those red blood cells to give up oxygen. And so I think, that can be a factor as well. So it's a lot of factors that I'm not sure we've completely figured out at this point either.
Hey, friends and listeners of the Switch for Good podcast. Yep, that's you. I have some really exciting news. Dotsie and I have started a Switch for Good podcast Facebook group. We created it so we can build a community of fans that will help us improve the show and deliver on the topics that you want to learn more about. So we want to hear what your favorite content is, what you want more of, and what you want less of. And if you like the length of the show, Dotsie and I are always talking about the length of the show, right, Dotsie?
Yes.
We want to tailor our show around the needs and desires of our incredible listeners, almost 500,000 of you. And it's really simple to join. Just go to our Switch for Good Facebook page. That's Switch, the number 4, and then Good. And then click on groups. And there we are, the Switch for Good podcast chat. You can post directly in the group, share ideas, talk to other listeners, and connect with like-minded folks. So go, run, join our Facebook group and tell us what you want. So how does the gut maybe a healthier gut improve performance for an athlete, and why does that happen?
Well, right now the studies are not definitive that it does or doesn't, but there's definitely data to suggest that it could, right? So there was a study that looked at elite cyclists that were professionals compared to amateur cyclists, and they looked at their gut microbiome, and they had higher prevalence or higher numbers of bacteria, certain bacteria that were really good at degrading carbohydrates, that were really good at, that were anti-inflammatory, for example, and also that were anti-inflammatory. And so, again, cause and effect, we don't know, but the higher levels of these bacteria were associated with an enhanced ability to train more. So they could actually train longer. And so they think that this has to do with the ability to convert lactate into a source of energy as well. A lot of these postbiotics that we talk about can serve as a good source of energy for athletes. And a couple of studies have actually sort of taken feces from athletes and put them into mice, and found that the mice then were able to run longer or swim longer, that basically it improved their endurance. So at this point, these studies haven't been done on humans, but there is a suggestion that maybe there could be some blood doping, not blood doping, but fecal transplant is the new form of doping.
Oh yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah. So Dotsie, I've been meaning to ask you if you could donate some of yours to me.
I don't know if you want it now, though. I don't behave as well as I did before with my diet.
And the other potential way that it could help is, when we do very hard, intense efforts, as I was doing at altitude in Leadville, we see this leaky gut, kind of, for lack of a better term. And so there's this loss of intestinal integrity. And so this then allows endotoxins or other things to get into the bloodstream and can cause problems. And so when we increase when we have a healthy gut, we increase our production of these postbiotics. And these postbiotics are also play a role in maintaining the integrity of this gut lining. And the gut lining is fascinating. I mean, there's different layers, and it basically lets the good stuff in and keeps the bad stuff out. And when that becomes disrupted, the bad stuff can get in. And like I said, that causes problems. And so again, we haven't really studied this, but theoretically, that could be another reason why having a healthy gut could help with performance. So that's, like I said, the studies are limited at this point, but I think it's a super interesting area of research coming up. Yep.
Great.
That needs to be in Game Changers too. Right. So they have research.
Yeah. There was one study on mice. And they used antibiotics on the mice, and they wiped out their bacteria, killed off their bacteria, and then they infused these postbiotics, like acetate was one, infused it back into the mice and restored their ability. So when the bacteria was wiped out, they couldn't. Their endurance was terrible, and when they reinfused some of those postbiotics, then it restored that ability to their endurance ability. So, yeah, it's fascinating. Anyway, sorry.
I just wish they would do those studies on humans, because there's a lot of humans who would love to be participating in those instead of using mice. But that's the vegan in me. Let's talk about.
Yeah, I know. I agree. Yeah.
Because we have to do the study again anyway on humans. We can't just leave it there at mice. You might as well just skip the mice. Let's talk about leaders. You've worked a lot with high-powered executives to try and help them become their best. And one of the ways that you focused on was not so much, how their business acumen was or how well they dealt with people, but how they took care of themselves. Why? I've never heard of that before, and it makes total sense that a leader would be a better leader when they are healthier. But can you talk a little bit about what you saw and how it affects a leader to be healthier?
That's a great point and question. And when we started this work back in the mid-90s, that was very novel. The idea that we would include a fitness and health component within a course for leadership development. And now people are like, oh yeah, it makes total sense. And it does in a number of ways, right? So it's helpful in a number of ways. So first of all, we talk about the difference between routine health and optimal health. So routine health is the absence of disease, and optimal health then also includes things like vitality and having energy to do leisure time pursuits. And so one of the facets of leadership is it takes a lot of energy. And so, this is your energy, of course, is impacted by all those lifestyle behaviors: diet, exercise, sleep, right? And so when those are in place, we see energy levels go up. And we'd often hear back from executives after they went through the course, and they'd say, you know what, I've started to eat a healthy diet, more plant-based diet. I'm exercising a little bit more. My energy levels are through the roof. I'm sleeping better. And we actually did a study where we looked at leaders. Are you familiar with 360 instruments? Do you know what that is? When
I just know Microsoft 360. I don't know what you're speaking about.
All right. So the company that I worked for, the Center for Creative Leadership, they were sort of the pioneers in this. And so they created assessments called 360 assessments. And so they get people to rate them on different leadership qualities or competencies, such as financial acumen. So they get their boss to rate them, they get their peers, direct reports, board members. So they get this 360 look at themselves as others see them, and then they rate themselves as well. And so when there's gaps in either direction, that's either an opportunity or for development, or that's an unrecognized strength that they might have. And so we did some research looking at executives who exercised, for example, on a regular basis. It wasn't a ton of exercise. It was sort of meeting minimal guidelines. And we actually found that those who exercised got much higher ratings on their leadership compared to those who didn't exercise. So that was one study that we did.
And did you have any ideas about why?
No, well, again, it's hard to imply cause and effect. So this was an association. So we didn't know if leaders were better because they exercised or because they could find time to exercise. Did that make them better leaders? We assume it's probably, the fact that, exercise is stress relieving, it can be energizing, and mentally, I think that's the key. And so one of the areas that we focus on in the courses is to speak to the benefits of exercise, the benefits of sleep, and the benefits of a healthy diet to mental cognitive function and performance. And so, we sort of joke around and say, we know you didn't get hired for your 6-pack abs or the size of your biceps. You got hired for what's up here, right? And so I think that connects to, you have to be quick on your feet. You have to be able to process information very quickly. You have to remember stuff. So all of those cognitive domains are impacted by regular exercise, are impacted by, an antioxidant, nutrient-rich, anti-inflammatory diet, which by its nature is a plant-based diet. So that's kind of the connection that we try to make. Yeah.
And what is it like many leaders are still working at the height of their career at age, 50, 55, 60, 65. And I don't know if men go through this. Some changes I've heard that they do. It's not directly, obviously, called menopause or perimenopause. But what happens to the brain? And I'm just going to give you my example. When it seems like out of nowhere, I knew names, places, and things and people. And now it's like, do you remember the person at the thing, at the place? Like nothing is accessible. Right? And it just really does feel overnight. And I'm going, okay, what do I do? What I'm doing all the things that we're talking about on this podcast, I think pretty well. Mm-hmm. I'm sure I could be doing slightly better, but way better than maybe the next person, right? That's on the standard American diet and sitting on the couch. Possible. So yeah. What is that? What do we, and how can we fix it? I'm going to just turn this right on me.
Yeah. I often joke and say the older I get, the more time I spend looking for things I just put down.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, I think I'm losing my mind kind of situation. So when we look at the aging process in the brain, we see that there's a little bit of shrinkage that goes on. Some memory loss is normal. That's going to happen. The problem, of course, is, if you can't find your keys and you find them in the refrigerator, that's usually not a good sign.
Okay, good to know. That's not happened yet.
So there was actually a study that was just published in December of last year, 2022. And they looked at lots of different lifestyle behaviors. So they looked at diet. And they looked at social interaction. They looked at mental stimulation. They looked at exercise. They looked at alcohol and smoking. I think those were the primary ones. And so the people that were really good at that. Oh, let me back up for a sec. So they used adults that were older but healthy. So they didn't have mild cognitive impairment, and they actually followed them over time, right? And they really wanted to look specifically at memory loss, okay? So they weren't concerned with other cognitive domains that are associated with dementia. So this was a little bit separate than dementia. And so they found that there was memory loss in all the groups, the group that had the highest adherence to the group that had the least adherence. They also included they also looked at genetics, right? So they also looked at those that had the APOE4 allele, which is associated with higher risk of dementia and Alzheimer's. So basically they found that those that were highly adherent to all of these behaviors, their rate of loss was much slower compared to those that were least adherent. The worst people, the people that did the worst, were people who were the least adherent with the APOE4 allele. When they looked at the high adherence, it didn't matter if they had the allele or not, if they had that genetic predisposition or not. So this was sort of the good news, that these lifestyle behaviors can mitigate that risk associated with that gene. Yeah. So it was, yeah. And they also, they then sort of looked at which component of lifestyle was most important. And they actually found that the dietary factor was the most important. So the healthy diet was the most important. I think the second one was social interaction and connections to people. I think exercise was third. Alcohol was the least important, but it was still associated. So yeah, I think Dotsie, yeah, I mean, I think some memory loss is normal. Some brain shrinking is normal. It's just like osteoporosis. We're going to lose bone density as we age, but you just want to slow that rate of loss, I guess. And lifestyle behaviors can certainly do that for sure. Yeah.
And the shift that women go through, I might also see it return, possibly, like a little bit better than it is now. I've talked to women that are, through the change, and they said it, gets much better. Yes, there's some, brain shrinkage as we go along, but for women that are listening that can't remember anyone's name or anywhere they went and their names, it's that's something that can return after this
menopause,
this hormone seizure. Yeah, that's what I call it.
The M word. Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. And that goes again back to gut health as well. I mean, the equal producers versus the non-equal producers. I don't know if you've had conversations about that with anybody, but, that's an interesting topic. If you compare Asia or Asian women, traditional Asian women, they don't even have a word for menopause because it's so rare, right? Or the hot flashes that is so rare. And now they're looking at that, they're finding in the younger Japanese women, hot flashes and things like that are on the climb. Again, they're sort of, I think, adopting more of an American style or Western style diet. And so we think that this has to do with certainly soy products can help increase this equal production.
Okay, so the equal is not in soy, but it increases the production in your body.
Right. So that's part of that's a type of postbiotic that is produced when we metabolize the soy. But not everybody has those bacteria that can do that. Vegetarians actually tend to be higher equal producers than non-vegetarians. But I had pretty rough time with hot flashes, so I'm assuming I'm not an equal producer. Yeah. So there could be an inheritable component there as well. I don't know, but it's all very interesting. And unfortunately, I mean, the studies are so focused on males, and there's limited research on females and menopause, and I think it's getting better, but yeah, it needs more for sure.
The New York Times Magazine had a cover story on menopause, and I just listened to it on a podcast, and it's shocking how little research there is on menopause. So, but anybody who wants to go to that, just Google New York Times and the things you can do to help. She talks a lot about hormones, which is something I've been on for over a decade. Worked very well for me. Yeah. When you were writing, you've written a lot, and I read something you wrote about why fish is not the brain food we need, because a lot of people will think, oh, well, I need to ingest more fish because it's good for my brain. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. And I think fish has a little bit of a health halo that perhaps isn't quite as deserved. And the reason I think it has that is because compared to red meat or other animal foods, fish is better. So in a relative sense, it's a little bit healthier. I always have a hard time with this question a little bit because you want to be true to the research, and that's basically what the research shows. Now, of course, the the problem with fish, I always tell people, is twofold. The first is contamination levels. And so when you look at foods that are contaminated with dioxins and mercury and metals, plastics, fish ranks the highest every single time. And it makes sense because our waters and rivers have become, sort of the sewers of the world, so to speak, and everything ends up there. And so then the fish take it up. And then particularly if you eat fish that eat other fish, and so there's this bioaccumulation that goes up the food chain. They've measured contamination levels in water. They measure it in algae in the water, goes up. They measure it in the fish that eat the algae. Again, you see 100-fold increase in those levels of contamination, and then fish that eat other fish. And the scary thing, of course, is that a third of the fish that we catch gets fed to animals like chickens and cows, which doesn't make any sense at all. And so I think that from a health perspective, from a hormone perspective, these can be quite disruptive, these dioxins, these PCBs. They're actually known as hormone disruptors or obesogens. You're probably familiar with this. And now we're starting to see studies that show higher rates of diabetes with higher fish consumption. And so again, this could be tied back to the sort of concerns around metabolic health. The second problem, of course, that with fish is ecological, and it's a very damaging it's very damaging industry. We just don't care about it because we don't see it, and because we're depleting fish stocks at such an incredible rate. They're predicting fishless oceans, I don't know, by the year 2050 or something like that. So that's a scary thought. But again, unfortunately, fish does have this halo effect. Now, so the question, of course, then is the omega-3. So that's always the reason why fish is cited as being healthy. And so, we can supplement those pretty easily, and get the benefits of that. So, but that's a whole another topic of conversation.
And would that be from the source where the fish get it from? So the seaweeds and the algae that they eat?
They don't make it; they just get it from their diets, just like land animals get it from leafy greens. So fish get it from algae and seaweed, so it's much better to get it, for us to get it from algae and seaweed in the form of a supplement, if that's recommended. There is something called the omega-3 index that you can measure in your blood. That's a test that you can get, and it looks at kind of the ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 within the red blood cells, which is a good proxy for levels. And so they find that that vegans actually are quite low who don't supplement. And so people have sort of said, well, that's not good news for vegans. And in the general population, they say, well, people with a low reading on this omega-3 index have more problems with brain health and more problems with cardiovascular disease. But vegans also have lower rates of cardiovascular disease. So I'd like to see a study where they compare vegans who supplement versus those that don't, to see if there is an added benefit from getting omega-3s or not. I'm not sure that study will ever happen, but who knows? You never know. Yeah.
And what leafy green is highest in the omega-3s for us land animals to consume?
Purslane is pretty high.
Oh, great! I've never eaten that. What is that?
I'm not sure. I've never eaten it either. That's just what I've heard. Okay. But it's if you think about land animals, they eat leafy greens all day long. So the actual amounts in leafy greens is quite low. We would get it more from nuts and seeds. So, yeah. So, but we're not going to eat 3 tons of leafy greens every day.
Enough to, right. Okay. Yeah. So stick with the nuts and seeds. You talk about the difference between routine health and extreme health, and why do we need to aim for extreme health?
Well, I mean, I hear that word and there's probably 2 reactions, right? It's like, well, that's too extreme for me. There's no way I could achieve that. I have to do extreme things to get there. But at the same time, I think it sounds attractive. I mean, who wouldn't want extreme health? So it sort of suggests a high level of energy, a high level of vim, vigor, and vitality, so to speak. However, I would define it more as looking at long-term health. So, what is your health going to look like 20 years from now or 30 years from now? And so it's really those things that you do on a daily basis, that you put money in the bank and you say, you know what, this is money in the bank because 30 years from now, I want to be able to do Ironman triathlons, well, or whatever it is you want to do. I want to be able to travel. I want to enjoy that retirement. And so to me, that extreme health has that sort of ability to age well, as age healthfully as well. So it has to do with health span as well as lifespan, I guess. Yeah. Yeah.
The Center for Creative Leadership found that 75% of executives work better when they eat better. It also found something interesting about executives, that in the 80s and 90s, when most Americans' weight was skyrocketing, that executives did not seem to show those high obesity rates. I can think of a couple reasons why that might have happened. But I want to know from you, what's that about? Are they better at taking care of themselves, or are the fat executives not getting hired?
Yeah, Alexandra, I don't know the actual answer to that question, but I can certainly give some ideas. So yeah, when we looked at our data over 20 years, we didn't see a very big increase in obesity rates. So I think this probably also has to do with socioeconomic level. So people at the higher socioeconomic level are less likely to smoke, more likely to eat a healthy diet, more likely to have time to exercise. It could also be a filter, right? And so we actually published a study where we looked at how leaders were perceived based on waist circumference. So waist circumference is a visible cue of obesity, and they were seen as less positive, even if they were equally as effective. And so we do have these sort of stereotypes in terms of, if someone's overweight, that they're not quite as competent, perhaps, or whatever it is. It's a little bit more negative. So this could be, again, it could be part of the reason. Is there a selection process going on? I also think that, people often think that executives are heart attacks waiting to happen. And that's not actually true. They do, they're better than sort of most people in terms of, again, their diets, what they have available to them. They have resources. I mean, stress, that's a whole different topic, but, they have resources to be able to deal with stuff. So there's a lot of things in their favor, but at the same time, they are workaholics. I mean, they work in 60 hours a week, and they travel a lot. And so again, it's sort of this mixed bag of not so good and good things. I just published a study that described executives and some of their lifestyle behaviors. And again, what we found over the years is that a higher percentage of them actually now exercise regularly. Right. So that was a very positive trend that we found. Exercise rates are going up among executives. It's over 50% that do it on a regular basis. Very few of them smoke. They don't drink a lot of alcohol. The martini lunches are gone. That's a thing of the past. And it's I think it's strenuous work. And so to a degree, you have to have a measure of health in order to be able to do the job. You can't do it if you're not healthy, to a degree, right? If you have, at the very least, you have to have routine health to be able to do the job. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's kind of how I would see it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
In talking about that and like total health, and we talk about the need to exercise, why we need to exercise it as it relates to keeping us really sharp at what we do. Neurogenesis versus angiogenesis, and angiogenesis is like pretty exciting because that's actually forming new blood pathways if I'm not mistaken, new, like actual formation of new blood vessels, which I didn't realize till just not that long ago that we had the ability to do that. So talk to us about that, if you wouldn't mind, the difference between the two and how much exercise we actually need to keep us sharp. Because I think after listening to this podcast, I mean, so far it's like people are going, oh gosh, I got to do a lot more than maybe what I'm doing now to keep sharp. So I'm sure everybody's a little different, but generally speaking.
Yeah. So that's I don't know the sort of final answer on that. Here's what I can say is the threshold to derive cognitive benefit is actually not that high. So there was a study looking at women, and they found that just walking about, I think it was around 150 minutes a week, that was sort of the threshold that they needed to achieve in order to get some of these cognitive benefits. And, exercise is so beneficial to the brain. For, angiogenesis, we improve blood flow, blood supply to the brain. The brain is very dependent on blood flow. It demands about 20% or more of our cardiac output, more blood than a fully working quadricep muscle. And so when we can improve blood flow to the brain, we see an uptick in brain performance, and the opposite is true. And so the healthy diet is important because we don't want those cranial arteries to get plugged, full of plaque and clogged, because that again reduces blood flow to the brain. And so the more clogged those arteries get, the faster the rate of cognitive decline. And so exercise may or may not help those clogged arteries. In fact, we see in male runners, we see higher levels of atherosclerosis in marathon runners in males than we do in sedentary people.
Is that going back to what you said, which is that they might think that they can outrun their diet?
Yeah. We think, the studies for whatever reason didn't actually look at diet. Yeah, they didn't look at diet, which is shocking to me. But they didn't compare. They looked at risk factors. So yeah, we see increased production of something called BDNF. You've probably heard of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. That's what's responsible for protecting existing neurons, growing more neurons. They've actually been able to reverse, to a degree, brain loss in older adults, by engaging in an exercise program. And so, as somebody once said, exercise improves brain function in just about every way that we can measure brain function. And so I think this is something that is more helpful to do it more, maybe lower amounts more frequently than lots of amounts less frequently, if that makes sense. Yeah. So it could be dose dependent. The more you exercise up to a certain point, the better your function will be. But we don't know sort of what the sweet spot is for that, Dotsie. But probably doing things like Ironman triathlons makes you stupid more than smart. I don't know, but
crazy, not stupid.
Crazy. Yeah.
Is the central reason for this improvement in brain function, exercise improves brain function? Does it mostly have to do with oxygen and oxygenation of blood flow to grow tissue?
I think it's that, and I think it's also the brain-derived neurotropic factor. So that's probably the longer-term benefit, where the short-term benefit is probably just you're getting better blood flow. It's not pooling in, and when we sit down all day, it's pooling in our asses, basically. So it does sort of help get blood flow up to the brain, and that's gonna help with brain function on a more acute basis. But yeah, it's probably just a combination of factors as well.
And mental health. It's like the cheapest therapist out there.
For sure.
And that's probably very oxygen derived. Okay.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
What about, we haven't talked about sleep, which you do emphasize in your program as really important, but most executives don't get, I think CCL reported that only 15% of executives in one study got 7 to 8 hours of sleep, which is what people say we need. Why is sleep so important? Because I actually used to poo sleep. In the 90s, there was that thing, I'll sleep when I die, I think, or I'll rest when I die, or something like that.
Yeah.
It was sort of poo-pooed if you needed a lot of sleep. Dotsie is a super sleeper, right? She needs a lot of sleep too.
Oh, Dotsie.
Yeah. And
Still am.
now I really recognize the importance of sleep. But could you tell people who are like I used to be, how important sleep is, and what strategies you might recommend for people to really prioritize sleep in their health plan?
Yeah, absolutely. So with what relates to Alzheimer's disease and dementia and cognitive decline, one of the things that happens when we're awake, we tend to produce something called beta amyloid protein, right? So that tends to go up. So beta amyloid protein is like the precursor to amyloid plaque in dementia. And so when we sleep, we actually break that down. And so if we're extending our wakefulness time and decreasing our sleep time, we're going to start to accumulate more of that beta amyloid protein. And that's going to increase then in turn our risks for Alzheimer's disease as well. And so that's, lack of sleep is one of the risk factors for, of course, getting Alzheimer's disease. The other thing that happens when we stay awake is that we increase production of something called adenosine. So if you're familiar with ATP is the energy currency of the body. As we burn through energy throughout the day, we break that ATP down and we get something called adenosine. And adenosine starts to build up in the brain. And as that builds up in the brain, it binds to receptors in the brain and it makes us tired. It makes us feel sleepy. So that's called the homeostatic, sort of one of homeostatic sleep type of cycle. So we have the circadian cycle, and then we have this adenosine that starts to go up and up and up and up. Now, caffeine can block binding of adenosine to these receptors. So that's one of the reasons why caffeine can be quite invigorating, sort of stimulates us. It makes us feel less fatigued. And so people can have a little bit of a vicious cycle where they are tired during the day. So they drink caffeine to offset that. They don't sleep well. So then they're kind of wired and tired, as we say. So they think they're performing well because they have a lot of energy from this caffeine, but caffeine is blocking that binding. The most effective way to reduce adenosine is to sleep. So when we sleep, those adenosine levels drop. And then we wake up hopefully refreshed if we get enough sleep and we have enough energy, we start the process all over again, right? Now, the problem with jet lag is when we have a circadian rhythm that does this, so that's governed by melatonin and cortisol. And if that is not aligned with this increase in adenosine, so if those things are offset or mismatched, that's a real problem, right? So that's really the basic definition of jet lag as well. So I probably answered that more than you need to know, but yeah, you can only get by for so long without sleep. It's going to catch up with you really quickly. And people sort of think that they are doing okay. And Alexandra, I don't know if you felt this, but they've done studies where they've sort of deprived people of sleep for about 4 days. And they say, hey, how do you think you're doing? And they're like, I think I'm functioning just fine. I'm doing just fine. But when they actually test them, they're not. Cognitive performance is in the tank, basically. But we kind of adjust to those new levels of drowsiness and we think we're okay. So just from a brain function perspective, it makes all the difference in the world. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I was probably that person who thought they were doing fine and wasn't.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, and you're absolutely right. I think executives now these days with the 24-hour business cycle, it's a big challenge to get quality sleep and enough sleep. Yeah. And sometimes one of the things I tell them is like, all right, yeah, maybe you're going to have, short sleep one night and longer sleep the next, but look at your hours per week of sleep as opposed to per night, right? So one night of poor sleep is not the end of the world. you want to accumulate about 40 to 50 hours per week. And that's a different way of looking at it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
You did your doctorate on what I think is a really interesting cross-section on exercise and the immune system. And I want to learn some of your key findings. I know as a professional athlete, I was always, all of us were always, you always had the conversation, I don't want to get sick. And it wasn't I don't want to get sick because, I'm on a plane or there's germs. Of course, that's how you get it. But it was always, we knew that the harder we train, the more we suppressed our immune system. And it was like, we knew we had gone kind of over the overtraining lip, right? If we got sick, like we knew that's what it was from. But I don't think we really knew any of the science behind it necessarily, right? So you could just kind of almost call it an old wives' tale, but it was to the T every time, right? When we went over the lip, out there, got sniffly, sick, sore throat, which is also, I think, why so many elite athletes who are, maybe multi-time world champions go to the Olympics and get 10th, and most of the time it's because they got sick. Right when they got there, right before they left, right? Because they had trained so hard and then they were so stressed because the intensity of what they were about to do, right? And how much it mean that it's so typical to hear that story.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And the work that I did was actually early days in this process. I mean, I was sort of like one of the first to look at exercise and immune function. And so what I looked at was an antibody in saliva called IgA, so immunoglobulin A. And this serves as a first-line defense against viruses and pathogens that come in through the airways, by touching things and then touching your mouth. And so what we found was that more intense exercise tended to reduce production or concentrations of IgA. Now, there's some debate since about, okay, maybe we should have looked at flow rates and generally speaking, but I think there's general agreement that, like you said, Dotsie, intense exercise can certainly leave you immunocompromised. And what we found was that, there was this window where following very intense session, IgA levels would be suppressed and then they would bounce back a few hours later. And so this was sort of the window of susceptibility, where you really didn't want to have exposure to certain bugs and germs. Again, some of the newer stuff, people are debating that, but like I said, there's a reason why hard training puts you at higher risk for getting, particularly an upper respiratory infection as well. Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Thank you so much. It's your research has helped so many people who excel in whatever area they're in, and we're really looking forward to reading the book. Do you have any idea when it's going to come out?
I wish I did. Okay. Publisher out there, right? Yeah, we're pitching it right now to a number of different publishers. So it's basically written at this point, but hopefully it'll be in book form soon. So
I'm sure it will. Yeah. It will. Thank you so much for being on our show. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was fabulous. Thanks a million times. I'm so glad that we got to meet and this happened. Hey, folks. Okay. Back by very popular demand is our plant-powered plate fridge magnet, which you are going to receive for free if you leave us a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. So here are the details. Just write your quick review. Does not need to be long, does not need to be a whole story. Just be honest and speak from the heart. Then take a quick screenshot of the review you wrote and email it to us at podcast@switch4good.org. That's podcast@switch4good.org. And include your mailing address so we can send you a power plate. We are doing this because the more reviews we garner, the higher we go in search results, which means more folks will learn about our podcast. So the power is in your hands. Leave us a review and zoom, your power plate arrives at your doorstep.
So thank you so much for tuning in today. If we helped you in any way, then click the subscribe button and let's keep hanging out together. We have so much more to share with you.
And if you need more information on actually making the Switch for Good, please visit us at switch4good.org for loads of info. And you can subscribe to our mailing list where you will receive all sorts of super cool gifts, discount codes to our very fave dairy-free products, and a lifetime of powerful health tips.
So join us on the journey to Switch for Good. This is the future.